Over to you, Patrick.
Hey, it's really great to be with 350.org, in South Africa. Mandla, way to power to the people. Power to 350. When I hang out with you, it's often at Standard Bank in Rosebank, out protesting, and the kind of 350 and Extinction Rebellion and Community Makua, Mining Affected Communities United in Action, Palestine solidarity, all of our protests show at least that we can make a dent. They've had to put up a big fence there. So it's great to be back with the team. I think so much of the knowledge that we get in the sphere of climate finance comes from social justice movements. And you are amongst the leaders in the continent. It's great to be able to chat just quickly now about 10 minutes of the background. The background is also so important here in Johannesburg because of this, the G20. And that comes here in November, although in September, if anyone's in Cape Town, there will be the environment ministers. Of course, there's G19 really, because the Yankees, the US, are climate denialist, climate debt denialist, and cutting USA, doing millions of casualties, including here in South Africa without AIDS drugs, without food in Sudan, without climate programs. So I'm hoping everyone's quite aware that there's a very big geopolitical background. It's not just the G20, because the G7 within the G20 knows the West, and that's historically the main emitter. So one of the aspects of climate finance is the debt, the need for $1.3 trillion in areas of mitigation, but loss and damage, especially for African countries, as well as the costs of adaptation. We'll come back to that at the end. The point is that it's the G7, and I want to add the other group within the G20. There are a few others as well, but it's basically the G7 and the BRICS. So you can sort of see what's going to happen in November as a power structure. My fear is that on issues of debt and dollars and the climate crisis, there's not an anti-imperialist BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and an imperialist West. They're actually working much more closely together in three ways. The G7 historically, especially the US, the largest emitter, and then the EU, 27 countries, Britain, Japan, but also the BRICS, which have the number one emitter at the moment, China, plus Russia and India, major emitters, South Africa, very much. In fact, per person per unit of output, we're the fourth highest in the world. And also, we're very diverse in terms of access to funds and our own debt crises. South Africa just borrowed last week from the World Bank. Terrible decision, $1.5 billion, adding to our $170 billion foreign debt. And you can see that we're in the junk category, as is of course, Russia, because it's defaulted. Iran has not been able to get access. Egypt can't get access to funds. Ethiopia defaulted and is junk. That was in just before it joined the BRICS in late 23. Brazil is also junked. And so we've got now 10 BRICS countries, the original Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus one very rich country, UAE. And there's Indonesia, there's new countries, as I've mentioned, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia. So 10, and there's Saudi Arabia sort of on the fence. And then there's quite a few partners. But the defaults on these debts are very important because they go back, and it's one route that you have out of a debt crisis. That is, you simply clear away the prevailing debt and start again. And so I'm hoping that we can get into what is an odious debt so we can justify the defaults on debts. One big issue for the BRICS, which is in the background, I think it gives you a sense of the structure of power, is whether we can avoid the US dollar in future. Because as you could see there, Donald Trump, not happy to hear about the BRICS being potentially a source of de-dollarization, because what they are able to do, and I happen to work in the Federal Reserve in the early 80s when the man called Paul Volcker put up the interest rate. That's really one of the core original problems of the African debt and the Latin American debt. So when we look at the big debt outflows of interest in a second, you'll see that we have a long problem here, the debt crisis of the early 80s, because of the US Fed, and they have the so-called exorbitant privilege in the US to print money, that is quantitative easing, these funny terms, and then to raise the interest rates. And what Donald Trump the maximum imperial, power monger and businessman says, I hate when countries go off the dollars. And he's really talking about the BRICS. He threatened 7 times to put 100% tariff on goods. So what we'll see, not just in Seville, where these sorts of debates aren't really happening in FFD, but more broadly, it's terribly important to put the debt and the climate into context of world monetary power. And unfortunately, calls for a BRICS currency, a central bank cyber currency, coordination on trade finance are not happening. There's a little bit on the third category of using national currencies, but the new development bank, the Shanghai-based BRICS bank, is not using local currencies very much. Only 23% of its loans are in local currency. So you borrow in the rand, for example, or there may be some other new African countries, Algeria just having joined a few weeks ago, that would want to borrow locally. And then they wouldn't have a big high interest rate when their currency crashes. If the currency does crash and you need to go to the International Monetary Fund, there's a contingent reserve arrangement. It's $100 billion. It's a lot of money potentially, but it's never been used. And South Africa's gone to the IMF instead of going to this contingent reserve arrangement, suggesting that it's really a bit of a myth, like the BRICS credit rating agency that was advertised and never has emerged. And then we get to BRICS reforms because the Bretton Woods institutions at the heart of this global system, set up 1944 in the United States, with South Africa, half the world's gold, underneath where I am now in Johannesburg. And the US had the other half in Fort Knox. And they set up the world financial system in the interest of a tied dollar gold relationship that then in 1971 the US defaulted on because it was seeing too many of its dollars going abroad and it didn't want to lose all that gold in Fort Knox. So it's a chaotic situation where these two institutions, the IMF and the World Bank in Washington, set up in 1944, South Africa right at the heart of that decision, acting as a creditor, having all the gold, against all the debtors. The debtors were led by an Englishman, John Maynard Keynes, and they really failed, and hence the IMF and the World Bank are very much against the interests of debtors. In fact, Keynes had a heart attack just after he concluded those negotiations. When we see the BRICS putting more money into the Bretton Woods institutions, their personnel deployed into the Bretton Woods institutions, their ideology at the Bretton Woods institutions, we don't see any change. So I'm just giving you a sense that not just at the Seville FFD, where we're going to run up against a very, very adverse power structure of the G7 minus the US, the West not coughing up enough. It's even going to be on Sunday and Monday in Rio de Janeiro, just as bad. And this is ironic because in hosting the G20, okay, that's going to be November here in Johannesburg, Cyril Ramaphosa has said he wants to see much more climate finance and debt relief. So the call is there. However, the reality is appalling. No improvement for debt sustainability, as I'll show you, as the commodity prices, which is the way many African countries can raise money from raw materials, the minerals, sometimes fossil fuels. Of course, we don't want that to happen. We want compensation instead, just energy transition partnerships to compensate for not extracting fossil fuels, as well as cash crops. So those have been crashing. They crashed in 2014-15, which gave us the first round of the most recent debt crisis in Africa, and they've crashed from mid-2022. And the Federal Reserve was part of that, raising interest rates. Again, just that power of the dollar that I mentioned. At the same time, we've been seeing, of course, we could just say South Africa alone with Durban, just take one city in April 2022, over $1 billion worth of damage, but especially 500 lives lost in a rain bomb, April 12, 2022. That loss and damage is another feature of what we're demanding, be compensated as the climate debt, the reparations, the polluter pays damage. The financial institutions that we're working on, again, all power to 350.org with Bill McKibben, a founder, originating the divest invest, so getting your banks, your insurance companies out of fossil fuels and into renewables. That's gone into reverse since Trump came to power in January, and then his tariff attacks and the aid cutback. So we're looking at a terrible situation in terms of the balance of forces, maybe symbolized by the man that was chosen to handle debt for Africa in the G20, South Africa's former finance minister, Trevor Manuel, and he's also the chair of Old Mutual, our biggest insurance company, and the deputy chair of Rothschild, which is, one of the great big French imperialist banks. So the conflicts of interest, because his institutions have outstanding funds in Africa, you expect him to try to write down that debt. They chose the wrong man. His ideology is very neoliberal, having once been a left-wing anti-apartheid activist. He was even considered as a candidate to be the head of the IMF. One reason is because he arranged that big G20 bailout of the IMF back in 2009 when he was South Africa's finance minister. What are we left with? In the last 15 years, a resurgence of the debt crisis after some debt relief, moderate debt relief, but it did help for funding, especially education, especially the girls going to school. It had been kept out, and then healthcare in many African countries in 2006, 7, 8. But then the debt started coming up again, especially after the commodity price crashed. And then when the interest rates went up from the United States in 2020, there was a short period for Africa of a G20 debt relief program. It wasn't substantive, it was just delaying, not actually giving any cancellation. So we're looking now at the debt default risks. Countries in debt distress, Zimbabwe has been in default for a long time, Zambia, Ethiopia. Those are two that did default, along with Ghana. And Sudan, of course, in a massive crisis, and other countries in Africa. You can see across the world major debt default risks. So if we really had good leaders, if the BRICS were kind of strong and against Western financial imperialism, not just rhetorically, but really, then we'd see a debtors cartel like Fidel Castro and Julius Nyerere, and even Robert Mugabe had proposed back in the mid-'80s. Unfortunately, they didn't implement that. Only one or two countries, like especially Ecuador, have done a debt audit so they can find the corruption in their country's foreign debt and then demand that they not have to pay. Let's quickly move to the climate debt. I'll just wrap up with this, because the climate debt, especially with all the extreme weather events, now we can start to measure in a much more serious way. It's not going to be the carbon tax. South Africa's is only in US dollars, 38 cents. The European Union is around $70. But in reality, even the World Economic Forum, right, even the brain of world capitalism in Switzerland says it could be $1,056 per ton. And I've even got colleagues in London who say actually 3,000. So that's the damage being done every time we emit a ton of carbon. And these are the guys that committed in the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Conference of the Polluters, Conference of the Parties. I always get that wrong. That COP17 you probably heard about. You see Jacob Zuma, South Africa's former president, very corrupt. And Lula, the current president of Brazil, Barack Obama, Wenjiba Manmohan Singh. That's where they come together. And those are basically the historic emitters and the current emitters. Those are the ones with the biggest climate debts, right? And those climate debts there, you can measure in different ways. We could, for example, accuse Britain of running up a climate debt for India that India shouldn't pay because it was under colonial rule. And those are the sorts of measures that we can look at. I'll send you these slides so that you can kind of get a sense of the nuance of how we'd want to do so, and look at the ways in which the other big factor, which is that the West takes our environmental goods, especially non-renewable resources. You can see in the World Bank chart from even the institution most responsible for so much of this debt and the climate crisis, the World Bank, they even admit in their November 2024 report that the poorest countries per person lost 60% of their wealth. So I think 350.org, as you think about the climate debt, the massive damage done by fossil fuels, but also it's the extraction systems, it's the deep digging that requires usually fossil fuel energy, and the smelting and processing. And yet the resources, those non-renewable minerals, those go abroad and we get very little back. It's not only the West, again, the Chinese especially, but also South Africans and others in BRICS are also doing a sub-imperial sort of processing, as we've been seeing in the debate over Eastern DRC. But the benefits mostly, from a telephone would be going to Apple and, California instead of the workers in Foxconn in China, or the kids digging it out in the Eastern DRC. Last points are about the strategy. Number one, those G20, the people in Seville and the G7, the people in power, even in the Lula-hosted UNFCCC COP30 in December, they basically don't want to cut the emissions, right? Like that cartoon said. Secondly, they don't want to admit that they have a climate debt. And thirdly, they want to privatize the air. They want to sell the right to pollute. So the emissions trading scheme and the offsets, and you can look at the slides later, some of the analysis in a new paper that I've done, just to show how absurd it is to let bankers try to solve the problem of the world. Last slide. What are the bottom line points that the climate justice movement, including 350, has always argued for? First, we need carbon taxation and trade sanctions and pricing, but done in a judicious way. We don't think emissions trading and offsets work. They're just gimmicks. They let the banks get more profits, and then they fail to solve the problem of emissions. And then we need, instead of debt-based climate finance, we need grants. We need to treat commercial insurance with extreme caution. And then we need to demand the climate debt, loss and damage reparations, the costs of the climate proofing, adaptation, and compensation for poorer countries and communities' use of the carbon space, for example, leaving fossil fuels underground that's now precluded due to people in the wealthy countries, and especially other corporations, over emitting. I hope that makes a little bit of discussion that gets us going into the gory details of the FFD, or if you want, the BRICS, the G20, and the COP30. These are important events coming up, and we've got to get out there to protest and make clear our opposition to the power structure. Thank you, dear friends.
Thank you, Patrick, for helping contextualize the debt situation, as well as ending it on such a powerful note. Absolutely, we need to be calling for grants and not loans when it comes to climate financing, renewable energy. Next up, we'll be hearing from Ferran Pedro on the Sekukune social ownership case study, which has shown communities are ready to lead energy transitions. But unfortunately, the funding isn't ready. Ferran Pedro is the South African senior campaigner for 350africa.org. She's a socialist feminist activist and a leading member of the Climate Justice Coalition. She works hand in hand with trade unions and community activists, championing energy democracy and a transformative, just transition. Over to you, Ferran.
Hi, comrades. Amandla, as Comrade Patrick said. Power to the people. Thank you so much for including me in this panel. As Khalil explained, I've been working with community organizations and other partners on building a campaign for socially owned renewable energy in mining affected communities. And I'll be talking a little bit about some of the research that we've done, and as well as the kind of funding that is required to be able to really implement a genuinely just transition. So for over the century, multinational mining companies have extracted wealth from under our soil in South Africa, directly influencing the trajectory of our politics and our economy in their interest. The industry has been responsible for human rights violation, propping up the apartheid state, hyper-exploitation and death of mine workers. Mines have exposed mining-affected communities to deadly air pollution and various impacts of extractive industries like water pollution and so on. So the impacts of mines on communities cannot be underestimated. So mining affected communities like the one I work with, the Sekukune combined mining affected community in Limpopo, in the Sekukune region of Limpopo, are talking about a different vision of as we transition to a decarbonized economy. So organizations like SISMAC have a history of challenging mining interests when they negatively impact surrounding villages, when they retrench workers, or are impacted in polluting rivers or water supplies. Organizations like SISMAC have been challenging mines in the interests of communities for some time. Based on this experience, we partnered with SISMAC because we also see a vision for a genuinely just transition where we transfer not just we decarbonize our society, but also transform the economic relations of our society, so transfer ownership and make sure that communities are actually benefiting from a transition to renewable energy. So with SISMAC, we're building a campaign to transfer the wealth created from mining activities, but all extractive activities, to the people as a whole through what we call socially owned renewable energy. And this is not our vision. Socially owned renewable energy is a vision that stems from, in South Africa, in the South African context, the trade union movement. Sorry, let me just get a little bit of an incident with my computer. Excuse. My apologies. There we go. Yes. So I was explaining that this isn't a vision of SISMAC alone, but really this stems from the labor movement. So when NUMSA, for example, have been championing this idea, the largest trade union movement in South Africa, in Africa really, have been championing this idea of a socially owned renewable energy economy where we have municipal renewable energy parastatals, for example. So in 2012, NIMSA developed a program for socially owned renewable energy sector made up of a mix of energy parastatals, cooperatives, municipal owned entities, and other forms of community energy enterprises. They worry about the same things that we do, and as SISMAC does. Will decarbonization be another opportunity for corporations to enrich their shareholders while workers are left devastated? Will decarbonization be a guise to privatize public goods to the exclusion of the majority of South Africans living in poverty? Will we simply re-entrench the same inequalities decade after decade, now using the climate crisis as the shock to loot our country's wealth by private actors? This is the path that we're on if we don't radically change the way in which we are able to transfer wealth from extractive industries to ordinary communities working to fight for a just transition. In the context of South Africa's unreliable energy supply and efforts to decarbonize the economies, mining companies are now investing in renewable energy infrastructure to secure their own operations. So mining companies operating in Sekekune and across the country can actually contribute to a just transition by investing in socially owned renewable energy projects through meaningful social labor plans, through taxation of these extractive industries, to be able to partner with communities who then can purchase any accessible renewable energy generated locally. And this can create sustainable economic relationships and further incentivize community-led projects. So community energy projects, they aren't a panacea to the just transition, but they are a potential way, or the energy and climate crisis in South Africa, but they can make a significant contribution to the pursuit of climate and energy justice, particularly in marginalized communities where electricity tariffs as they are unaffordable. So when so many people in South Africa, for example, are living under poverty, 30.4 million people are living below the poverty line, will these people be excluded from wealth ownership forever? Will we entrench the unequal patterns of ownership again because the majority of people don't have access to capital and skills training? Or can we have a proactive legislative and regulatory framework so that communities are able to access the capital to be able to supply renewable energy, not just to offset electricity costs, but also to supply industry that should be contributing to the development of those communities in the first place, have both a historical debt and a transformational mandate to be able to develop economies, rural economies in particular. SISMAC have argued that rural communities can own, control, and benefit from renewable energy transition in community cooperatives, trusts, or different forms of collective ownership that have existed throughout our history. We have a history of collective ownership and collective management of our resources that is within our traditions. And so we can rest on these traditions and transform society and transform our economic and social relations in a way that can empower our African traditions and our African societies, and reorganize the way in which wealth is extracted and is able to contribute to the development of our country, not in concentrated pockets, but broadly, and including those that have been marginalized and excluded in the past. But just as we learned during the anti-apartheid struggle, the powerful don't act in the interest of the working class majority out of generosity or good arguments. They can only yes when they have no other choice. Winning a genuinely just transition isn't about goodwill, it's about collective power of the majority. To make it too costly for companies, corporations, and state actors acting in their interest to resist us. For this reason, groups like CISWAC 350, we're partnered with LHR, CALS, other NGOs in South Africa. We're working to build a campaign to bring together organizations that agree with our aspirations about developing a new vision for mining affected communities, where our national utility, ESCOM, our the Department of Mineral Resources, the Department of Electricity, and extractivist industries are working with the rural and township communities to provide grants, training, and technical support to be able to implement community-owned renewable energy. This is a vision where we have a meaningful control and ownership of our energy resources. And the power of the people is not simply in our ability to achieve individual success, but it's in our ability to achieve a vision greater than the sum of its parts through our collective action and solidarity. We know that mass movements have changed the country for the better. In times of uncertainty and cynicism, what will change the will of those in power is our collective power, the collective power of working class and unemployed people, organized and willing to fight. And so I hope that you join and keep an eye out for the People's Power campaign, as well as our initiatives to build with mining affected communities, a campaign for community-owned renewable energy through social labor plans and by taxing extractivist industries. Thank you. Back to you, Khalil.
Thank you, Farron, for those really powerful words. I just want to echo those sentiments that mass movements will definitely always improve our countries and world for the better. And thank you for sharing exactly how this new vision being proposed by mining affected communities, where our power utilities and municipalities work hand in hand with local communities, is possible, it's feasible, and it's scalable. Thank you. Next up, we have Cecilia Dewi, who will be sharing 2 examples in Asia, which prove the scalability and impact of community-led energy projects. Cecilia currently leads the Indonesia team of 350.org. With expertise in climate policy, advocacy, and campaigning, she specializes in indigenous peoples and local communities' rights to forest and land tenure in the context of a just energy transition. Cecilia is dedicated to building a youth-led climate movement in Indonesia, which empowers the next generation of environmental leaders. Over to you, Cecilia.
Yeah, thank you so much, Khalil, and thank you for the 350 Africa team for this opportunity for me to share some of the success stories of community-based renewable energy initiatives in Indonesia. Give me 1 second to share my screen. Yeah, so again, good morning, afternoon, everyone. I'll be sharing some successful examples of community-based renewable energy project across Indonesia. And these initiatives demonstrate how local communities are leading sustainable energy transitions through innovation, be it microhydro plants or solar installations, and that these projects not only provide electricity, but also create economic opportunities and building resilience and community ownership. Now let's begin with an impressive case of a community in East Java. So this is a community of village Gunung Sawur in East Java. They sit at the foot of Mount Semeru, one of the highest volcanic mountain in Indonesia. And in this village, a microhydro plant established in 1985 has been operating independently since 1992. So they are energy independent since 1992. So they have a 25 kilowatt capacity, and so far it has served 118 households, as well as 19 tourist stalls. And the price is very cheap. It only costs like $0.03. So very cheap for 450 VA power. And this is basically 1/3 of the cost of electricity that is provided by the state utility. And the impact extends beyond just basic electricity. This plant has powered local enterprises, including a snake fruit chips factory that is basically process the snake fruit that comes from the community plantations in the village. If you see this, the machine here, and also these are the women who are running the factory. And yeah, this is enabled by the microhydro plants. And there is also, in the recent years, they just started building this energy and microhydro education park, because the place is quite nice. It's microhydro, it's using water, so it relies on all the trees that are at the upstream of the mountain to make sure that the water resources and the power of water is sustained and can power the microhydro power plant. So yeah, it is it has a lot of, you know, exponential benefit to the community economically. And the microhydro plant started by an individual who is educated, having an engineering educational background, and getting married and stayed in a village without electricity, and, you know, think like, why not I start building something? And so he was the one who started the microhydro power plant, but then it developed into a bigger thing. So he has developed like a workshop where they build like maintenance and spare parts production, and they provide jobs for the youth. And the local workshops so far have manufactured and distributed 185 machines throughout Indonesia. And there is a lot of lesson learned with the machines that he's building. And so far, they have developed a system of microhydro plants that is efficient, with long economic life, and the equipment that lasts 20 to 50 years, and spare parts that last 3 to 6 years. But perhaps the most impressive one is the system's resilience. There was this the Mount Semeru that I mentioned earlier erupted on 2021. It's one of the biggest eruption that happened in history to the mountain, and there is a power outage that is following that eruption. But when that happened, this community maintained the electricity while the surrounding villages went dark. So it says something about the resilience. And yeah, that's case number one. And let's see another case. This is also microhydro plant in Kedungrong. It is a different province, but still in the island of Java. So this micro hydro plant established in 2016, and it began as a university student community service project. And then another thing happened, like the government came and also giving materials about micro hydro power plant and the potential in the area. And then the community then felt like they had to do it. And so they're doing it. And what started as powering just 6 households now serves 50. And that includes small businesses like the motorcycle repair shops that you see on the right-hand picture. And also wood carving workshops, just to name a few. And the community management model is particularly noteworthy. It's a bit different from the first one, where people are paying per consumption. On this one, residents pay monthly dues, and they pay less than $1 monthly fee just for maintenance. And when there are problems, they collaboratively troubleshoot it. And so far, it is quite impressive as well, with the fact that that the state utility already enters the village, but until now they use the plant provides 80% of the local electricity needs, and the state utility supplying just 20%. And another interesting thing is that in the same river, there are 2 other that we know, at least 2 other micro hydro plant spots that also create or generate electricities, but they are managed differently. The first one is it's community managed with monthly user fees, but there are operators that are government funded. And the second one is a micro hydro plants that is run by private sector fully, but then they sell the electricity to the national grid or the national utility or PLN, who is then distributing it to people. So there are different business models that are implemented in this community-based renewable energy that is very important to make sure that the projects sustain at the community level. And there is also the third one. This is rather a simpler one. This is basically, this is in Bali, where I am at the moment. If you see, Bali is, very touristy, but there are still villages that don't have access to electricity because their landscape is very difficult for the state utility to reach to, and this is one of the village. And so they are initiating an off-grid solar power plant of course, with the help from the government. And the beneficiaries of this power plant is 17 households, as well as public facilities, including their puras or their temples. This one started on 2017, and people don't pay anything. So it's free, but they have a couple of young people from the villages that is trained by the government to make sure that they know how to maintain and run the facilities. And there are actually many villages like this in Bali that still don't have access to electricities. In Indonesia, in total, there are more than 3,000 villages that still don't have access to electricities. And so this renewable energy, this decentralized renewable energy model is the greatest and the greatest opportunity for them to develop. And we also 350 Indonesia did a research with a think tank organization counting what would be the macroeconomic benefit for Indonesia if we are using and scaling up CBRE, and the number is quite substantial. So the GDP contribution is substantial, and the potential for reducing poverty for over 16 million Indonesians, it's an impressive number. And also the possibility to generate surplus profits of 609 billion for business actors and create an estimated 69 million jobs. Now, if we're imagining that Indonesia also a part of Just Energy Transition Partnership, like if we're imagining that just 50% of the JETI money funds were directed towards CBRE initiatives, Indonesia could develop 2.18 gigawatts of capacity, and this potentially replacing 3.3 coal-fired power plants. So it is very it's massive. And yeah, and our research and our process throughout the last couple of years of finding, the models of CBRE that works teaches us that community-led renewable energy represents an ideal model for just energy transition, and is also proving more cost-effective than fossil fuel-based generation when properly managed. And we also see that communities demonstrate remarkable readiness to participate in energy transition when provided appropriate knowledge, transfer, and capacity building support. And importantly, these projects deliver value beyond just return of investment. There is also a value of reducing emissions, the value of decreasing fossil fuel dependence in remote areas, the values of reducing interregional inequality, and the priceless value of creating broader social and economic benefits. And with proper financial support and regulatory incentives, these models are both replicable and scalable across Indonesia and definitely other countries. So in conclusion, the community-based renewable energy initiatives offer a powerful model for sustainable development in Indonesia. It provides affordable electricity, create economic opportunities, it builds resilience, and it offers a path toward equitable energy transition. That's it for me. Thank you so much. Back to you, Khalil.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. There was really a great presentation, and really interesting to hear exactly how decentralized community energy grids maintain their resilience and are mostly immune to the usual destruction that can be caused by natural disasters such as volcano eruptions. It was really interesting to hear. Finally, we will hear, before we move on to the Q&A section, we're lastly going to hear from Kate Blagojevich on how ultra-wealth taxes can support an energy revolution and the urgent need to challenge both oligarchy and the power of billionaires. Kate has been leading a regional campaign which aims to tax extreme wealth in order to fund a just transition, focusing on governments in France, Germany, and the UK, as well as global forums like the Financing for Development Conference. Her work brings a climate justice lens to the wealth tax debate, highlighting how taxing billionaires can unlock transformative investments in renewable energy, public services, and climate resilience. Over to you, Kate.
Very much. Hi, everyone, and thanks to everyone for being here. So today, I'd really like to talk to you all about one of the most powerful tools we have to tackle both rising global inequality and the escalating climate crisis, and that is taxing extreme wealth of billionaires and multimillionaires. So while billionaires and fossil fuel giants are raking in record profits and hoarding their wealth, governments around the world are slashing public services, cutting aid budgets, and insisting there's just not enough money to go around. But the story of scarcity is actually a myth. It's not a fact, it's a fiction and a dangerous one. In the UK, where I am, we hear it all the time. We just can't afford more climate action. We can't afford overseas aid. We don't have the money for better public services. In fact, just last night, the government won a vote to cut benefits to disabled people using this very argument. And it's just not an economic reality or necessity. It's a political choice wrapped up in economic language. And so while we've got leaders talking about tightening belts, there are wildfires raging, floods, other climate impacts which are forcing people from their homes. Health systems are buckling under the strain of climate disasters and lack of investment, and every delay costs lives and livelihoods everywhere. Billionaires and fossil fuel companies, though, are making obscene profits. And if it feels like there's no money, that's because our systems are designed to protect and concentrate wealth and not share it. And it's not scarcity, that's hoarding. Oxfam research shows that a modest tax of around 5% on multimillionaires and billionaires could raise $1.7 trillion every year. And the wealth of the richest 1% has surged $33.9 trillion since 2015. And that's enough to end annual poverty 22 times. And yet billionaires only pay around 0.3% in real taxes. This week at the UN Financing for Development Forum in Seville, leaders do have a critical opportunity to face the real issue, a global financial system that's built to reward pollution and fuel inequality. But these rules aren't set in stone, and they're choices. And the good news, momentum is building to rewrite these rules. Recently in France, over 100 senators voted for a 2% tax on billionaires. And although the measure didn't pass, it sent a very strong signal that serious action on wealth inequality is on the table. Public opinion polls from the UK this year showed that 77% of people would rather the UK government increase taxes on the very richest people to improve public finances than to see cuts to public spending. And polling in many G20 countries last year also showed similar levels of very high public support for taxing the super rich to help fund increased climate action. So it's absolutely vital that we keep pressure on governments and keep demonstrating that we demand these policies to be implemented and for the money to be spent on public services and climate action that will benefit us all. But there are some countries that are actively blocking progress to tax the super rich and redistribute that wealth. Countries like the UK, USA, and many countries in the EU bloc are still clinging to a very outdated economic dogma. And the recent reductions in aid by the UK, USA, and Germany, for example, are deeply, deeply concerning. Although Germany's 500 billion euro package is a step forward, a very small percentage is earmarked for climate finance and remains insufficient. It's also this week been uncovered that the UK is only on target to meet its international climate finance commitments through double counting overseas aid and relying on private sector investment. These kinds of accountancy tricks have no place coming from governments that want to be considered as climate leaders on the world stage. These countries should be pressured to revisit their commitments and align financing with their historic responsibility and capabilities, because it's just not responsible governance. It's refusing to face reality. Part of the reasoning given by some governments behind the stagnation or rollback of progress can be put down to the rise of the far right in many countries. The rise in political success of the far right has generated a toxic narrative that migrants and refugees are to blame for economic strain, and that climate change is a hoax, and any action to reduce carbon emissions is an expensive waste of money that ordinary people are being duped into paying for. The far right are weaponizing climate politics and turning people who are struggling with the cost of living against climate action altogether. I don't have all the answers, but at 350.org, we're trying to deliver a message that it's not people fleeing from climate disasters, drought, poverty, or war who are bankrupting our services or causing inequality. It's the billionaires hiding trillions in offshore accounts and not paying what they owe. We also want to connect with communities through our organising work to set our sights on billionaires, to force them to pay up and improve lives, and build relationships and power in communities that bring people together and influence local leaders. So what could we do with the money? We've already heard some brilliant examples earlier, and it's so inspiring to show how it could create better lives for everyone, everywhere. In Europe, for example, we know that a wealth tax could improve the lives of those who are marginalized in Europe. For example, hiring thousands of new care workers, building affordable, well-insulated homes, scaling up the rollout of heat pumps and renewable energy, and cleaning up our polluted cities. It could raise people's standard of living, especially those who are struggling with the increased cost of living. We could and should finally make the richest polluters pay for better libraries, hospitals, and homes, as well as climate action. And so, Seville must be a turning point, and this summit is a test, a moment to ask, will nations like the UK, France, Germany, Canada, other rich countries continue defending this broken status quo, or will they embrace a future of fairness? And any slivers of progress need to be celebrated and built on. So it is great news that an alliance between Brazil and Spain has formed in Seville to drive the agenda of taxing the super rich forwards. This joint initiative is highlighting the need to address the problem of growing extreme inequality and achieve greater wealth redistribution through progressive tax systems. Their objective is to get more countries, as well as international organizations and civil society, to join their initiative to promote and evaluate legislative initiatives related to the taxation of the ultra rich. And so countries should and must seize this opportunity to step up on leadership for finance for development, with a strong emphasis on climate and nature finance, as much of this has very unfortunately been stripped out of the Seville outcome document. But strategic coalitions can help drive ambition and accountability forward at a time when geopolitical context is so very difficult. So the leaders are facing a choice. Do they stand with fossil fuel executives and tax avoiders, or with teachers, nurses, and future generations? There are other moments this year, including the G20, and of course, the run-up to and COP30, where our voices must be heard to ensure that leaders make the right choice. And it's our job to make sure leaders know whose side we're on and which side we want them to be on. We have a big job to do to be heard against the loud voices of tech billionaires and big oil, but we do outnumber them, and together we will succeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate, for those powerful words. You're exactly right. This kind of profiteering in a crisis at the cost of the people is unacceptable. And I really appreciate how you explained what we mean when we call for a fairer financial system and a just transition, one in which billionaires don't exist at the cost of a fair wage, and one in which a new solar farm doesn't cost you your local hospital or school. I've noted that we have got some questions in the Q&A feature. So I think we can now move on to the Q&A section. And I'll just pass the questions over to whoever on the panel feels they're best able to answer it. The first question that I've noted here is the role of trade unions in the global fight for climate justice, particularly how trade unions have been using the right to collective bargaining for climate justice. Perhaps, Farron, that's a question you can speak to.
Sorry, could you read the question? Oh, how has the trade unions globally used the right to collective bargaining for climate justice? I'm not, I don't think I'm the best person to answer this question. Comrade Vuyo, you're in the labor movement, so perhaps you have an example of the ways in which collective bargaining has been used for climate justice. Vuyo?
Good morning.
Hi. Hi, Comrade Vuyo. Do you have an example of the ways of any way in which collective bargaining has been used for climate justice by trade unions? I don't have an example off the top of my head. Yeah.
Sharon, this is for me a recent thought, particularly as we were approaching our last workshop we had at the gender links, that I found that there's this big gap in the trade union movement, that we are not using bargaining as an instrument towards achieving our objectives around social justice and climate justice. So it's an area that I must develop, okay, within the next 2 weeks or so. As you know, that we're also trying to create a platform that you will be part of in terms of social justice. But I know in NUMSA and in ESCOM previously, some 10 years or so ago, we did put up a bargaining demand in the collective bargaining forums in ESCOM about ESCOM providing water geysers, I think, for its employees as part of the process of alleviating problems of pollution and negative climate change. So it's an area that we must continue talking about. I thought with international experience being in this global platform at this moment, some comrades from some elsewhere in the globe might be able to bring some light into that. But it's an area that I think is important and urgent as we are trying to get labor a central role in the struggle for social justice and climate justice. I would pose the things.
Oh, thanks, Theo. I don't know if you'd like me to comment on that, Khalil, but just to say that I think perhaps the panelists have other experiences in other countries where they are trade unions involved in just transition struggles. But I think because in South Africa, definitely we've got programs. So COSATU has, they've outlined a program for just transition or a platform, their demands and on what they think should be happening. But I think because trade union organizations have are quite in a defensive posture at the moment, and are trying to sort of reorganize and dealing with retrenchments and attacks on wages and now attacks on labor law, collective bargaining in South Africa, that there haven't been as many opportunities to, or they haven't found the opportunity to be able to take on a positive program for climate justice. So or pursue demands for climate justice in collective bargaining, develop a program so that you can properly decide, what your demands should be in different industries. So it could be, for example, that, in a trade union federation, the union organizing inside of the chemical industry has an analysis of the chemical industry and their emissions, and then is making demands when you have wage negotiations or collective bargaining negotiations across the industry, then we could be making those demands. But because our organizations are, just defending the rights that we've got, which I think also speaks to Kate's point around the rise of sort of right-wing policies and right-wing governments, these the push against our democratic rights and participation in society and policy making has been very successful, and so we really have to make sure that we are not just defending gains that, historical gains, but also pushing for something new, pushing for um, uh, in all spheres of our in all spheres of struggle, because the truth is that the climate crisis will affect the working class majority, the working class, organized labor, the working class in Africa, the absolute most. We are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate disaster. And so we absolutely should be taking every avenue to be able to push for elites to be doing the right thing. They're not going to do it without us demanding. And organized labor has an important role to play. And I would argue, at least in the South African context, that we're not doing enough. And I'm so grateful that comrades like Comrade Vuyo in NUMSA and on the ground in various places in the organized labor sphere are taking on this struggle and beginning to put together a program. So well done, Comrade Vuyo, and yes, there's more to do. Khalil.
Thank you, Farron, and thank you, Comrade Vuyo. I see we have a hand from Lugendo. Would you like to ask your question, Lugendo? Lugendo, we can't hear you. Okay, it seems like Lugendo might have some problem with their audio. While they sort that out, I see we have another question, which I think was addressed directly to you, Cecilia, when you were speaking about the 3 examples in Asia. This question is from Samson. How can I replicate these energy supply projects in my local community? As an agricultural extension specialist, I work among local farmers, youths, and conduct research on smallholder farmers in rural communities. I need a step-by-step guide. Energy and power supply is a major problem in my country.
Yeah, thank you so much for this great question, Samson. I think there are many ways to it, but first of all, the community has to be organized to be able to obtain the facilities. In the experiences in Indonesia, many communities are unfortunately has to wait for years to be able to get the facilities either from the government or the grants. But they started somewhere. I think, especially in many rural areas, they are lucky enough to have some people who are educated that is not moving to the cities, stays there and applying, their knowledge and their skill to start. But then it takes, a lot of concerted effort. Like, it needs to be orchestrated in a way that it brings relevant partners in there. And like for some communities, it started as well with like as I mentioned, some students coming to the communities, and then people got inspired, and then they are learning more from it, and then they're proposing projects to whoever will be able to fund it. So some communities go directly to their local government, and I think some communities also got money from some companies. I think in many cases, there are also fossil fuel companies who are handing out, tiny bit of their money for development of CBRE. But I think now that we need to have everyone on board. We should not say no to that, because we need to, we need to approach it differently, but have a clear stance that, all this, small amount of money that they're giving to communities for renewable energy is not washing, their responsibility for the harm that they're done to the community somewhere else. So yeah, it takes a lot of work, but I think that what we're talking about at the moment is all these things that takes years. How do we make sure that it is scalable, right? And there is the answer to that is also for us to also addressing the major blockers in each countries. And for us, mostly it is money and it is regulation, and that's why we need to build our collective power to address those things. So while there are works to be done at the community level to help, and needs many people on the table, including people who have technical expertise and stuff. In parallel, we also need to work on making sure that collective power is being built to address the blockers and to address the issue of the political will. I hope that answers your question, and thank you for dropping your email. Maybe we can be in touch.
Thank you, Cecilia. I see we have another question from Masudi Haji, who is the CEO of Earth and Humanity Initiative. They're asking, how can we ensure that climate policies and actions prioritize the needs and rights of vulnerable communities, such as low-income populations, indigenous peoples, and small island developing states? The second part of that question is, what role should climate justice play in international climate negotiations, and how can we balance the needs of different countries and stakeholders? And the third is, how can we address the disproportionate impact of climate change on women and girls, particularly in developing countries? Would you like to answer that one as well, Cecilia, or Kate?
Sure. Give me a minute to read the question again. Yeah, I think a lot of things can be done. One of the things that the 350 is doing, we want to make sure we hear directly from the people, passing the microphone to them. And in that way, we give them the space to tell their stories, and while we're also working to make sure that there are the right people to amplify it. And yeah, there are so many campaigns and tactics that we could do, and the first thing is making sure that their voices are being heard. And I think one thing to note here is when it comes to solutions that is coming from communities, we need to also emphasize that they can contribute, but it is not fair to ask them to be the one who's taking the burden of providing climate solution. So what we should do instead is we're highlighting the stories that they have, and basically do it as an inspiration that if people from small communities could do this, why not bigger actors are doing the fair share. And I think fair share and common but differentiated responsibilities, it's principles that we need to keep on repeating time and time again, so that we make sure that it is those who are most responsible who take most of the actions, and that they are doing their share of contributing and financing climate actions in developing countries and marginalized people, not as a charity, but as a responsibility and as a debt that they have to pay.
Thank you, Cecilia. I see there's a question from Annalicia Nhlane, directed to Kate. How can the UK balance its financial obligations with the need to invest in climate mitigation and adaptation strategies?
Thank you so much. I mean, I think what we're seeing is that the UK government is choosing to say that there isn't enough money to invest in all of the things that it needs to invest in. But as we've just heard from Cecilia, the UK government has a huge historical responsibility when it comes to climate change. And therefore, it has a huge responsibility to actually invest in climate mitigation, adaptation, and to pay for loss and damage as well. And so I think there is, of course, a balance to be struck between, you know, the needs of people who live in Britain and who don't have very much, and they absolutely need to have a responsibility to provide benefits and a functioning healthcare system and housing for people in the UK. But as I was saying, you know, the myth that there isn't enough money and that means that we need to scale back on our obligations for international overseas aid and for climate finance is a myth, and that they have chosen to take a stance on not increasing taxes. And so this is a huge huge mistake that they've made, because they've really cut off one of the major sources of revenue to the country to increase taxes on the wealthy in particular, but also obviously on corporations, because corporation tax is very low also. And so simply by increasing taxation and then redistributing that wealth both in the UK, but also as a responsibility to repay its climate debt, as you know, the founder of coal power, it really does have a responsibility to make sure that international climate finance obligations are met, and not through, as we've just discovered that they're doing, by double counting a bit of aid going to some countries as climate finance. It's simply outrageous that they're doing that. So I think, yes, there is a balance to be struck between ensuring that people within the UK are getting their basic needs met, but I think that there is certainly enough money to go around to make sure that the UK is repaying its historic responsibility as well. Thanks very much for the question.
Thank you, Kate. I see we have a few hands. I'm going to welcome Sasa Emmanuel to ask their question.
Yes. Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Sasi Malo James from South Sudan. My question is that the first speakers explained about the meeting in Spain, that the objective of that conference is to tax the official companies and the rich people, big rich people in the world. And then my question is that how can, because these people has huge money, even if we tax them, they will pay the money. But the carbon emission and fossil fuel will continue. What can we do to reduce the fossil fuel and carbon emission in atmosphere, which is affecting our community, affecting our health, is affecting all climatic change? Because these people has already money. Even if you tax them, they are going to pay the money, but the carbon emission will remain in the atmosphere. So what can we do to reduce the impact of fossil fuel, which is affecting our plant, which is affecting our life? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sasa Emmanuel Jones. Kate, do you want to take that question?
I can have a go, I think. So I know that, for example, there is an initiative being put forward by Greenpeace and another organization called Stamp Out Poverty. And they are running a large coalition called Make Polluters Pay. And they are putting forward the idea of a carbon damages tax. And the idea is that the tax on fossil fuel companies would be so high that it would de-incentivize drilling for fossil fuels, because ultimately it would truly dent the profits of the fossil fuel companies, and it would make extraction just too expensive. I think there's some way to go before we hit that kind of target, but we can see that there is growing momentum around taxing fossil fuel companies, and a huge amount of anger about the profits that they're making, as well as obviously the pollution that they're causing through their extraction. And so I think that there is a dual focus on taxing their profits, but also to stop them drilling at the same time. And the two, obviously, just like you're saying, have to go hand in hand. But I think that they do very clearly, because if you can get those taxes up high, it will really de-incentivize extraction. And if you were actually to get the subsidies that you need to take removed from fossil fuel companies and also given to renewable projects, that would incentivize renewables as well. And so it has to be kind of this dual approach of also removing subsidies, higher taxation, and redirecting those funds to renewables so that they become that kind of unstoppable force that we're seeing. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Kate. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, so we only have time for 2 more questions. So I'm going to welcome Frederick and then Umo to come on and ask their questions. Frederick, the floor is yours. Okay, Frederick must be having some issues with their audio while they get that working. Umo? Frederick, can you hear us?
Hello.
So the floor is yours. Hello.
Yes, nice to be with you this moment. good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your destination. But from us in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria, this is morning period. My name is Umo Iswaiko, the coordinator, Peace Point Development Foundation. We work on environmental and climate justice in Nigeria. I think from all the conversations so far, I think all what we need is for us to transit from online to physical, especially at the community level. I think we have left the community to suffer so much fighting for themselves while we only gathered online and in our halls to discuss. Currently, in the past 1 month, we have been struggling issue of oil spill in a community in Akwa Ibom State, Nigeria, by Sterling Global. Our regulator, we went there physically to interview, but the opposition was much because the company has been able to go ahead and empower the communities with their false solution, which the community now believes them. So what do? We started advocacy at the national level with their representative at the national level, and we are going to the state level, and we are trying to break through at the local government level. Good enough, that community is in a local government called Eastern Obolo, where Sterling Global operates. Thank God the spill spread across to another local governments who have taken them in Equitable, who have taken them to courts. So we have been able to link up with the community and see how we can fix a meeting for next week or after next week to see how to debunk some of these perceptions and team up with them. So we need more collaboration from all like-minded bodies. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Umo Isuaiko. That was a really powerful call to action that we need to organize more with people on the ground, with communities on the ground. I'm going to welcome Stella to ask their question.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Stella.
Okay, good day, everyone. Stella, I work with Society for Women and Youth Affairs. We're here from Port Harcourt, River State in the Niger Delta. I really want to appreciate everyone, every presenter, especially when Kate was speaking, she's in the UK, and with the complaints, it bothers me because the situation of most African countries are really pathetic, especially that of Nigeria, with 7 decades of oil exploitation, with all the climate crisis we have down here. So when I get complaints from maybe like people complaining, I just wonder because our situation here is really a pity state. Especially now that fossil fuel companies are all hiding under indigenous companies in the name of divestment. Yet they are securing funds for their parent companies. They are really not divesting in any way, but they are just using indigenous companies while they are leaving behind the mess they have created. And the entire Niger Delta region still remains impoverished and grossly underdeveloped. Most companies are obviously still in darkness. There is no social security for the people from the region, yet it is the resources from the region that funds the entire country, and the parent companies of these fossil fuel companies in their own countries also. So I'm looking for also calling on global collaborators, to push actually for polluters to pay up for climate justice and also find a way to develop the Niger Delta. Also, we also need to like push for and monitor the funds if eventually funds come in. We need to find a way to like monitor the political scavengers within. I know that's a big problem for us down here. I strongly advocate for social security for the people of Niger Delta, and I'm appealing for like minds to push to support this globally. I don't know if we can get people to help us, and also some of the projects that were mentioned by Cecilia and the rest, we can also get them to other countries and scale them up. It will help communities in this region too. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stella. In terms of that collaborative work that you mentioned, I welcome everybody to share their contact details in the chat, their email addresses in the chat, to help facilitate that, keeping in touch after this call and starting to foster those networks of collaboration in our work. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. We have noted all of the questions that remain unanswered in the Q&A and as well in the chat. We will still answer those questions we couldn't get to and reply in the post-event email with the recording and presentations. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for the Debt, Dollars, and Climate Crisis webinar. Thank you to our panelists for the incredible contributions and for really making the case for global financial architecture reform, and how these weighty terms, whilst being caught up in lingo, actually have a lot of impact on us as everyday people, as working class people living in the global south and around the world. Thank you, everybody. And please enjoy the rest of your day, the rest of your morning, the rest of your afternoon or evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you.